Imagine spending your whole life proving you belong, only to see your own son fight the same battle. What would you do? Walk away, or teach the world a lesson it would never forget? This is the story of Malcolm Hayes, a pilot who's defied expectations his entire life. But when his son becomes the target of cruelty, Malcolm sets a plan in motion, not for revenge, but for something even more powerful. Stay with me. This is a story about power, respect, and knowing when to rise above. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The early morning light spread lazily across Brookstone, Georgia, casting long shadows on the quiet streets. It was the kind of town where familiarity ruled, where people knew each other by name, where traditions lingered longer than they should have. At Brookstone International Airport, the hum of engines filled the air, a steady reminder of movement, of places beyond the small-town borders. Inside the pilot's lounge, Malcolm Hayes sat by the window, his gaze distant as he sipped his coffee. He had spent over 2 decades in aviation, first as an Air Force pilot, then as a commercial captain for American Horizon Airlines. To some, he was a veteran of the skies. To others, he was a man who didn't belong in the cockpit. A younger pilot, Jeremy Cole, strolled in, grabbing a coffee before noticing Malcolm. "Morning, Captain Hayes," Jeremy greeted with a nod. Malcolm returned the gesture. "Morning, Cole. Denver route today?" "Yeah, first time flying that leg." Jeremy stirred his coffee. "Any tips?" Malcolm leaned back, setting his cup down. "That approach is tricky. Winds can shift fast, so don't fight the aircraft. Let it guide you." Jeremy nodded, absorbing the advice. Then after a beat, he hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Jeremy lowered his voice slightly. "Have you ever had passengers, you know, doubt you? Because of who you are?" Malcolm chuckled softly, shaking his head. "More times than I can count." He exhaled. "But at 35,000 feet, the plane doesn't care who's flying it. Only people do." Jeremy frowned. "That ever get to you?" Malcolm took another sip before answering. "Used to, but I realize their fear doesn't define me." Before Jeremy could respond, the PA system crackled, calling Malcolm for his pre-flight briefing. He rose, tossing his empty cup into the trash. "Safe flight, Cole." Jeremy watched as Malcolm walked away, an expression of newfound respect on his face. Later that evening, Malcolm's modest home sat bathed in the glow of the setting sun. Inside, his 12-year-old son, Jaden, sat at the dining table, pencil in hand, lost in his homework. Malcolm dropped his briefcase by the door, stepping into the kitchen. "How was school?" he asked, opening the fridge. Jaden didn't look up. "Fine." Malcolm paused, studying his son. "That doesn't sound like fine." Jaden hesitated, tapping his eraser against the table. "Just a lot of homework." Something in his voice felt off, but Malcolm knew better than to push. Instead, he nodded. "Well, if you need help, I'm here." Jaden offered a small nod, but he still wouldn't meet his father's eyes. Malcolm took a slow breath. He had spent his life fighting for respect, proving himself in a world that often questioned his place. But as he watched his son retreat into silence, a thought crept into his mind. Would Jaden have to fight the same battle? And more importantly, was he already losing? The next afternoon, Malcolm arrived at Oak Ridge Academy earlier than usual. He had wrapped up his flight schedule ahead of time and figured he'd surprise Jaden. As he pulled into the parking lot, something caught his attention near the side of the building. A group of boys stood in a tight circle. Jaden was in the middle. Something about the way they stood, the hunch of their shoulders, the low murmurs, set Malcolm on edge. He cracked his window, listening. "Come on, Jaden," one boy sneered. Brett Callahan, a name Malcolm recognized. Brett's family had old money in Brookstone, the kind that came with deep roots and quiet influence. "What's wrong?" Brett continued, his voice full of mockery. "Too good to talk to us?" Jaden didn't move. Another boy chuckled. "Bet he thinks he's special because his dad flies planes." Brett smirked. "A black pilot? Please. Probably flies cargo planes or cleans bathrooms." Malcolm's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Jaden flinched but said nothing. That hurt more than the words themselves. Malcolm could take the insults. He had heard worse. But Jaden accepting them? That was unacceptable. He pushed open the car door, stepping out with purpose. His presence alone was enough to make the boys shift uncomfortably. Brett's smirk faltered for just a second before he masked it with arrogance. Oh, look, Captain Airplane showed up. Malcolm ignored him and focused on Jaden. You ready to go? His tone was even, giving his son an out. Jaden hesitated before nodding quickly. As they walked toward the car, Malcolm turned slightly. Boys, he said, his voice calm but firm, ignorance has a way of keeping people grounded. You might want to think about that. He didn't wait for a response. In the car, Jaden stared out the window, his reflection barely visible against the glass. After a long moment, Malcolm spoke. Has this been happening for a while? Jaden's fingers curled slightly. It's fine. That's not what I asked. A pause. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, Jaden admitted, yeah. Malcolm's grip tightened on the wheel. He had spent his entire career proving himself, fighting to be seen as equal. And now his son was facing the same battle at 12 years old. He wanted to pull over, to say something that would make it all better. But what could he say that would change reality? Instead, he took a slow breath. I see you, son, and you don't deserve this. Jaden swallowed hard but said nothing. Malcolm knew he couldn't let this go. Not this time. As they pulled into the driveway, a plan was already forming in his mind. That night, Malcolm sat in his dimly lit home office, staring at a framed photograph on his desk. It was taken years ago, the day he had earned his commercial pilot's license. His uniform was crisp, his smile filled with pride. But it wasn't just about him. Jaden, barely 5 years old, was in the photo too, sitting on his lap, beaming like he had won the skies himself. Malcolm traced the edge of the frame with his thumb, his mind replaying the scene at school earlier that day. The way Jaden had stood there, silent, absorbing every cruel word. The way he had just accepted it. That thought sat in Malcolm's chest like a stone. He had taught his son about discipline, respect, and hard work, believing that if Jaden just did everything right, the world would have to acknowledge his worth. But now, watching his son shrink under the weight of other people's ignorance, Malcolm realized that wasn't enough. Jaden needed more than just guidance. He needed to know how to fight back, not with fists, but with presence, with confidence. Malcolm set the photo down. He had an idea. The next morning, Malcolm leaned against the kitchen counter as Jaden walked in, rubbing sleep from his eyes. I was thinking, Malcolm said casually, pouring himself a cup of coffee, how would you feel if your class took a field trip to the airport? Jaden blinked, still groggy. What? A trip to Brookstone International. I could set it up, give your class a tour, let them see what goes on behind the scenes in aviation. Jaden frowned, sitting down at the table. Why? Malcolm sipped his coffee before responding. Because I think it's time people see things for what they really are. Jaden poked at the toast on his plate, his expression unsure. I don't know, Dad. You know, Malcolm said, taking a seat across from him. When I was in flight school, people doubted me before I even stepped into the cockpit. They looked at me and assumed I didn't belong. Jaden's fingers tightened slightly around his fork. They weren't waiting for me to fail, Jaden, Malcolm continued. They expected it. He paused. But the second I took control of that plane, the moment they saw I could do what they couldn't, their opinions didn't matter anymore. Jaden looked up, something shifting in his expression. This isn't about proving anything to them, Malcolm said. It's about making sure you never believe what they say. For the first time in days, Jaden sat up a little straighter. Okay, he said softly. I guess it wouldn't be so bad. Malcolm nodded, a small victory, but he knew this was only the beginning. Malcolm wasted no time. That afternoon, he arranged a meeting with Ms. Ava Martinez, Jaden's homeroom teacher. Ava had been teaching at Oak Ridge Academy for nearly a decade, one of the few faculty members who seemed to genuinely care about all of her students, not just the privileged ones. When Malcolm walked into her classroom, she greeted him with a warm but curious smile. Captain Hayes, she said, motioning for him to sit. This is a surprise. Malcolm didn't waste time. I want to organize a field trip for Jaden's class. To Brookstone International. I'll personally guide them through a day in aviation. Ava's eyebrows lifted. That's an interesting idea. I think it'll be good for them, Malcolm said. Good for Jaden. He hesitated before adding, I want them to see what skill actually looks like, what leadership and intelligence really mean, especially a certain group of boys. Ava's expression darkened slightly. She understood exactly who he was talking about. I can push it through the school board, she said. But I need to be honest with you, Malcolm. Brett's family has a lot of influence here. If they don't like the idea, then let's make sure they can't say no. Ava tilted her head. And how do you suggest we do that? Malcolm leaned forward. I'll make this more than just a simple tour. I'll arrange for the students to step inside an actual cockpit simulator, sit in on a real flight briefing, and even witness a takeoff from the control tower. If the school refuses, they'll look like they're denying an educational opportunity. Ava considered his words, then smiled. That's clever. If they reject it, they'll have to explain why. Exactly, Malcolm said. By the next week, the approval came through. On the day of the trip, the students piled onto the school bus, excitement buzzing in the air. Even the ones who weren't particularly interested in aviation seemed eager to get out of school for the day. At the back of the bus, Brett Callahan sat with his usual group, arms crossed. This is so stupid, one of his friends muttered. Brett smirked. Yeah, what's he gonna do? Show us how to push buttons? The others laughed, but when Brett glanced toward Jaden, something felt off. Jaden wasn't alone like he usually was. A couple of kids were actually talking to him, asking him if his dad really flew planes. Brett's smirk faded. For the first time, something unsettled him. Jaden caught Brett's eyes in the mirror, and for the first time, he didn't look away. The bus rumbled into Brookstone International Airport, coming to a slow stop near the private aviation terminal. The moment the doors swung open, the students piled out, stretching their legs, their chatter filled with excitement. For most of them, the airport had always been a passing blur through car windows, a place their families visited for vacations or business trips. But standing here, at the edge of the runway, surrounded by towering aircraft and the steady hum of jet engines, the air felt different. Malcolm stood near the entrance, dressed in his official captain's uniform, the gold stripes on his sleeves catching the light. He had worn this uniform thousands of times, but today he felt every inch of its weight. Jaden was one of the last students to step off the bus. He looked up at his father, searching his face for reassurance. Malcolm gave him a small nod. Jaden exhaled slowly, squaring his shoulders. Not far behind, Brett Callahan emerged, his usual cocky smirk firmly in place. So, what's the plan, Captain? Brett's voice was loud enough for everyone to hear, laced with mockery. Are you going to show us how to make coffee for the real pilots? A few kids snickered, but the laughter wasn't as loud as usual. Some of them still remembered the simulator incident, how Brett had crashed the plane in less than 2 minutes. Malcolm didn't flinch. He had dealt with turbulence stronger than a 13-year-old's ego. Instead, he smiled. Glad you asked, Brett. Brett's smirk faltered. Malcolm turned to the group. Welcome to aviation. Let's get started. Inside the pilot training center, the students were ushered into the flight simulator room. The simulator was impressive. A full-scale replica of a cockpit, complete with functioning controls, digital flight screens, and surround sound audio. A few students gasped as they stepped inside. This looks so real, one kid whispered. Jaden watched the reactions carefully. Even the kids who didn't care about flying couldn't hide their fascination. Malcolm clapped his hands together, drawing their attention. All right, who wants to be the first captain today? Several hands shot up, including Jaden's. But Brett, who usually jumped at any chance to be the center of attention, stayed silent. Malcolm noticed. Instead of calling on Jaden, Malcolm turned to Brett. How about you, Brett? Brett blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Then just as quickly, his arrogance returned. He shrugged, stepping forward. Sure, can't be that hard. Malcolm stepped aside, letting Brett take the captain's seat. With calm precision, Malcolm adjusted the settings. Unbeknownst to Brett, he had subtly increased the difficulty level of the simulator. All right, Malcolm said. Let's see what you've got. Brett grabbed the controls, his confidence unwavering. Until the alarms blared. Brett jerked back, startled as the screen flashed red. "You're stalling," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "Adjust your throttle." "I know that," Brett snapped, gripping the controls tighter. But the aircraft dipped into a nosedive, the warning signals flashing across the screen. "Pull up," Malcolm instructed. "I am," Brett growled, his fingers trembling slightly. The simulator shook violently. Then, blackout. The screen went dark. A computerized voice announced, "Flight terminated. Unrecoverable failure." Silence. Brett froze, his hands still clamped around the controls. Malcolm crossed his arms. "What did we learn?" Brett glared at him, his jaw tight. "This thing is rigged." Some of the students exchanged looks, but no one laughed. Malcolm leaned down slightly. "Flying isn't about ego, Brett. It's about skill, discipline, knowing when to adjust." Brett shoved himself out of the seat, storming to the back of the room, his face burning. Jaden watched carefully. For the first time, Brett wasn't in control of the room, and everyone knew it. The rest of the day unfolded in waves of discovery. Malcolm led the class through various aviation exercises, teaching them about navigation, weather conditions, and emergency protocols. Jaden got a chance to fly the simulator, his movements careful but confident. "You feel that?" Malcolm said as he guided his son through a virtual landing. "That's control. You're the one making the calls." Jaden's posture straightened slightly. Meanwhile, Brett had spent the rest of the tour silent, his arms crossed, his frustration boiling beneath the surface. The final stop of the day was the air traffic control tower, where the students got to witness a real takeoff from the observation deck. The group gathered by the glass windows as a commercial jet prepared for departure. "See that pilot?" Malcolm pointed. "He's about to take 300 people into the sky. He has one job, to get them there safely." The students watched in awe as the aircraft rolled down the runway, its engines roaring. Jaden could feel the power of it through the glass. And then, liftoff. The plane climbed into the sky, disappearing into the clouds. Malcolm turned to the students. "In this cockpit, there's no privilege, no status, no shortcuts," he said. "The only thing that matters is whether or not you can do the job." His eyes landed on Brett, just for a second. And for the first time, Brett had nothing to say. Back on the school bus, the atmosphere was different. Before, the students had been joking and chatting, treating the field trip like just another day off from school. But now there was a quiet sense of awe. Even the kids who hadn't cared about planes before were talking about what they had learned. Brett, however, sat at the back, his face stony and unreadable. For the first time, he wasn't the center of gravity in the room. Jaden stole a glance at him through the reflection in the window. For a long time, Brett had been the one who dictated how Jaden felt about himself. But today, Jaden had seen who really had the power, and it wasn't Brett Callahan. It never had been. The school bus rattled back toward Oak Ridge Academy, but the mood inside was nothing like the morning ride. Before, the students had been buzzing with anticipation, cracking jokes about playing with airplane buttons or getting free snacks from the pilots. But now there was a quiet intensity in the air. Some students were still processing what they had seen. Others whispered about how difficult flying actually was. A few even admitted that they had never thought much about pilots before today, let alone considered how much training and responsibility the job required. Jaden sat near the window, gazing outside as the airport disappeared into the distance. His thoughts weren't on planes anymore. They were on Brett Callahan, Brett who had frozen under pressure in the simulator, Brett who had stormed away from the group after failing in front of everyone, Brett who now sat at the back of the bus, completely silent. For the first time, Jaden wasn't afraid of him, not because Brett had been humiliated, but because Jaden finally understood something. Brett wasn't powerful. He was desperate to be, and that was the difference. Jaden caught Ms. Martinez's gaze from a few rows ahead. She had been watching too. She didn't say anything. She just nodded, as if she already knew what Jaden had just realized. It happened 3 days later. Jaden had spent the past few days feeling lighter, like a weight had finally lifted off his shoulders. He wasn't looking over his shoulder in the hallways anymore. He wasn't avoiding eye contact. For the first time in a long time, he felt normal. And then, Brett snapped. It was during lunch in the middle of the cafeteria. Jaden had barely sat down when Ethan and Lucas, 2 kids from his class, chose to sit with him. That had never happened before. Ethan set down his tray, grinning. Dude, your dad is a beast, Lucas nodded. That simulator was insane. I didn't realize how much goes into flying a plane. Jaden felt his face warm. Yeah, there's a lot more to it than people think. For once, he didn't feel awkward talking about it. He felt proud. But across the cafeteria, Brett was watching. His grip on his fork tightened. His friends weren't laughing with him like they used to. No one was looking at him. Instead, they were looking at Jaden. And that was the moment Brett lost control. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Within seconds, he was looming over Jaden's table, his presence casting a shadow over the small group. Oh, so now you think you're better than everyone? Brett sneered. Just 'cause your dad plays dress-up in a pilot's uniform? The table went silent. Jaden's stomach clenched. But this time, something was different. Slowly, he turned to face Brett. No, Jaden said, his voice even. I don't think I'm better than anyone. Brett's eyes narrowed. Then why are you acting like it? I'm not, Jaden replied. You're just mad that people are finally looking at someone other than you. The words landed hard. For the first time, Brett didn't have a snappy comeback. The cafeteria felt too quiet. Students at nearby tables had started eavesdropping, waiting to see what would happen next. Brett's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He wanted to hit Jaden, to knock him back down, to humiliate him. Instead, he grabbed Jaden's milk carton and dumped it over his head. Gasps erupted around the room. Milk dripped down Jaden's face, soaking into his shirt. His hands tightened into fists, but he didn't move. Brett smirked, waiting for the reaction. He wanted Jaden to lash out, but Jaden just sat there, unblinking. Then slowly, deliberately, he picked up a napkin and wiped his face. He didn't yell. He didn't push Brett back. He just stared at him. And for the first time, Brett looked uncomfortable. Because Jaden wasn't angry. He wasn't broken. He was done playing Brett's game. And Brett had no idea what to do with that. The cafeteria was frozen, as if time had stopped. Milk dripped from Jaden's hair, sliding down the collar of his shirt, pooling onto the plastic tray in front of him. The usual laughter that would have erupted after a stunt like this never came. The silence stretched too long. Brett shifted his weight, his smirk wavering. He had expected Jaden to explode, to shove him back, to make a scene. But Jaden just sat there, not broken, not humiliated, just watching him. And that was worse than any retaliation. At the far end of the cafeteria, Miss Martinez saw everything. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The way she marched across the room, heels clicking sharply, made the students tense. Brett barely had time to react before her voice cut through the air like a blade. Brett Callahan, principal's office, now. Brett blinked. For what? He snapped. Ava didn't even blink. Harassment. Public humiliation. Pick one. Brett's smirk fully disappeared. For the first time, he was standing alone. None of his usual followers jumped to his defense. They were watching, but no one spoke. Jaden had won, without saying a word. Brett let out a sharp breath and stormed out. Miss Martinez turned to Jaden, her expression softening. Come with me, she said gently. Let's get you cleaned up. Jaden hesitated, fingers curling around the edge of his tray. Then finally he nodded. As he stood, the cafeteria remained silent. Not out of pity, not out of fear, but out of respect. For the first time, Jaden wasn't the one walking away in shame. Brett was. That evening, Malcolm stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing a plate when Jaden walked in. His son had changed out of his milk-soaked clothes, but there was still something different about him. Malcolm could tell. Without turning around, he asked, You want to tell me what happened today? Jaden leaned against the counter, rubbing his thumb over a chip in the wood. Brett dumped milk on me, he muttered. Malcolm stilled, setting the plate down carefully. He grabbed a towel, drying his hands, then turned to face his son fully. You okay? Jaden shrugged. Yeah, I didn't do anything back. Just sat there. Malcolm studied him. And how did that feel? Jaden thought about it, about the silence that had followed, about how Brett's smirk had disappeared. It felt... Jaden hesitated. Then slowly, he met his father's eyes. Like I had the power. A slow, knowing smile tugged at Malcolm's lips. He reached out, squeezing Jaden's shoulder. That, Malcolm said, is the hardest lesson to learn. Jaden tilted his head. What do you mean? Malcolm pulled out a chair and gestured for Jaden to sit. When they were both settled, Malcolm tapped the table lightly. People like Brett, they only know how to win by making you lose control. They push, they poke, they humiliate, hoping you'll lash out so they can say, see, I was right about you. Jaden nodded slowly. He understood that now, more than ever. Malcolm continued. But when you don't give them that, when you show them that their words and actions don't define you, he smiled. That's when you take away their power. Jaden exhaled. A weight he hadn't realized he was carrying loosened in his chest. Sounds exhausting, he muttered. Malcolm chuckled. It is. He leaned back, arms crossed. But here's the thing. You don't have to fight every battle. His voice softened. Just the ones that matter. Jaden absorbed that. Then after a moment he asked, So, what do I do now? Malcolm studied him. Then calmly he said, Now we get ready for the next move. Jaden frowned. What move? A shadow of something calculated flickered in Malcolm's eyes. We make sure Brett remembers this lesson. Jaden sat up straighter. How? Malcolm's smile was calm, steady. By showing him what real power looks like. Jaden lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. His father's words echoed in his mind. We make sure Brett remembers this lesson. It wasn't about revenge. Malcolm Hayes wasn't the kind of man to waste time on petty payback. No, this was about something bigger. It was about changing the game. Jaden had spent months avoiding Brett. He had shrunk himself, hoping to stay off his radar. But now he saw things clearly. Brett's power had never been real. It had existed because people gave it to him. And the moment Jaden had refused to play the game, Brett had lost control. It was time to make sure he never got it back. The next day at school, Jaden walked through the hallways with purpose. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't rushing to class to avoid a confrontation. For the first time, he felt completely in control of himself. And Brett was watching him. Jaden could feel it, that sharp, unsettled stare. It happened in classrooms, in the hallways, at lunch. Brett wasn't approaching him, wasn't saying anything, but he was watching, and that was enough. At lunch, Jaden sat with Ethan and Lucas again. They weren't best friends, not yet. But something had changed. They were listening to him now. They weren't treating him like the quiet kid who stayed in the background. People were starting to see him, and that was what Brett couldn't stand. From across the cafeteria, Brett sat with his usual group. But something was off. His friends weren't hanging on to his words like they used to. Some of them kept glancing at Jaden's table. Not with hostility, with curiosity, with interest. And that was the moment Brett lost it. The real explosion didn't happen at school. It happened at home. Brett Callahan had always been the king of Oak Ridge Academy, but his kingdom was crumbling. That evening after school, Malcolm pulled up in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. Jaden frowned. Dad, why are we here? Malcolm didn't answer right away. He just nodded toward a large house down the street. Jaden's stomach tightened. It was Brett's house. Jaden had never thought much about Brett's home life. In his mind, Brett was just Brett, a bully. But as he sat in the car watching the massive house in front of him, something felt off. It was too perfect. The lawn was perfectly trimmed. The cars in the driveway were expensive. But then, a window was open upstairs, and from inside came raised voices. Jaden's breath caught. His father's voice was quiet. Thomas Callahan isn't just some rich guy. He's a man who built his entire life around control. Jaden's fingers curled against his jeans. The reason Brett acts the way he does, Malcolm continued, it's because that's what he's been taught. Power through dominance, respect through fear. Jaden swallowed hard. As if on cue, the front door burst open. Thomas Callahan stormed onto the porch, his expensive suit pristine, except for the look in his eyes. Rage. And behind him, Brett. Jaden barely recognized him. His shoulders were tense, his head slightly bowed, but his fists were clenched at his sides. You don't get to embarrass me like this. Thomas's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp. Brett's jaw tightened. I didn't do anything. Oh, really? Thomas took a step forward, his presence suffocating. First, I get a call from the school about you humiliating yourself in that simulator nonsense. And now I find out that you... His voice dropped too low to hear, but the way Brett flinched, Jaden's chest tightened. He had never seen Brett look small before. Brett had always been the storm, loud, aggressive, impossible to ignore. But standing there under his father's glare, he looked like a boy caught in the rain with nowhere to hide. Jaden had spent so long hating him, but now he wasn't so sure. Malcolm exhaled, finally shifting in his seat. I don't need to teach that boy a lesson, Jaden. His voice was calm, but there was something heavy beneath it. Jaden stared at his father. Why not? Malcolm turned the key in the ignition. Because life's already doing that for me. Jaden swallowed. He had wanted to see Brett suffer, to feel small the way he had made Jaden feel. But now all Jaden saw was a kid who was already drowning. And for the first time, Jaden wasn't sure if Brett was the real enemy at all. The car ride home was silent. Jaden stared out the window, watching the quiet streets of Brookstone pass by. His mind was still stuck on the image of Brett, standing on that porch, shoulders hunched, his father's voice cutting into him like a blade. For so long, Jaden had imagined what it would feel like to see Brett lose. But now, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt wrong. Malcolm finally spoke, breaking the quiet. You thinking about what you saw? Jaden nodded slowly, still looking out the window. Yeah, his father exhaled. I know that look, son. You're questioning things now. Jaden hesitated. I don't get it, he admitted. I should be happy. He's finally getting what he deserves, right? Malcolm didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled into their driveway and shut off the engine. Then he turned to face Jaden fully. There's a difference between justice and suffering, he said. One is about making things right. The other is just pain for the sake of pain. Jaden frowned, still trying to make sense of it all. Malcolm sighed, leaning back against his seat. I spent years thinking that if I just worked harder, if I was just better than everyone else, people like Thomas Callahan would have to accept me. He shook his head. But men like that, they don't change. And they're kids. They grow up either learning to be just like them or they fight against it, Jaden finished quietly. Malcolm met his eyes. Exactly, Jaden exhaled. And you think Brett's fighting it? I don't know, Malcolm admitted. But I do know this. He's not winning anymore. And that means he's got two choices. He either becomes worse or he figures out who he really is. Jaden sat with that for a long moment. Then he asked, and what do I do? Malcolm smiled. You do what's right for you. And sometimes that just means walking away. Jaden wasn't sure if it was that simple, but for the first time, he wasn't sure if Brett was his enemy anymore either. 3 days passed before Brett came back to school. Jaden saw him in the hallway before first period, standing by his locker, alone. For the first time, Brett wasn't surrounded by his usual group. For the first time, he wasn't the loudest person in the room. Instead, he just existed. Jaden had a choice. He could ignore Brett, keep walking, pretend like none of it mattered. Or, Jaden didn't know why, but before he could think too much about it, his feet were already moving. He stopped a few steps away from Brett's locker. Brett must have sensed him because he turned, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then quietly, Jaden said, I saw your dad the other night. Brett's whole body stiffened. His fingers curled into fists. His jaw clenched. Shut up, he muttered. I'm not trying to start something, Jaden said quickly. I saw how he talks to you. Brett's eyes flickered with something Jaden had never seen before. Something close to fear. You don't know anything, Brett snapped. Jaden hesitated. Then instead of arguing, he just shrugged. Yeah, maybe I don't. Brett blinked, caught off guard. Jaden adjusted his backpack. But I know what it's like to feel like you have to prove something. Brett stared at him, his shoulders tense, like he was waiting for a punchline. waiting for Jaden to mock him like he had done so many times before. But Jaden didn't. He just turned and walked away. And this time, for the first time, Brett didn't stop him. The days moved forward, slow but steady. Jaden didn't talk to Brett again after that hallway conversation. He didn't need to, because something had shifted. Brett wasn't picking fights anymore. He wasn't shoving kids into lockers or laughing at Jaden from across the cafeteria. He wasn't even talking much at all. But the biggest difference? Jaden didn't feel afraid anymore. He had spent so much time thinking that standing up for himself meant fighting back, that it had to be some big, dramatic moment where he finally proved something. But in the end, the real victory had been walking away with his dignity intact. Malcolm had been right. Power wasn't about revenge. It was about knowing who you were and not letting anyone take that from you. And Jaden finally understood that now. One evening, Malcolm stood outside with Jaden, watching the planes overhead as they blinked against the deep blue sky. "You ever think about flying?" Malcolm asked, his voice easy. Jaden thought for a second before shrugging. "Maybe." Malcolm chuckled. "That's a step up from never." Jaden smirked. "Yeah, well, I guess I like the idea of being in control of where I go." Malcolm's expression softened. He reached over, ruffling Jaden's hair. "You already are, son." Jaden looked up, watching the sky stretch wide and endless above them. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. At the end of the day, power isn't about dominance. It's not about proving yourself to the people who refuse to see your worth. True power is knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone take that from you. Malcolm didn't need revenge. Jaden didn't need to fight back with anger. What they needed was to show the world that confidence, resilience, and dignity speak louder than any insult. So tell me, have you ever faced a moment like this? A time when walking away was the strongest thing you could do? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. I'd love to hear your story. And if you want more stories like this, stories about justice, growth, and the kind of strength that can't be broken, make sure to subscribe, because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.